I have here the testimony of a listener who signs as Patricia from Bolivia. She wrote to me that what she is about to share happened when she was 51 years old, during a trip she took alone to a town where her family had lived generations ago. She says she went to seek her roots and found something that no one had warned her about. If you have a family story that hides more than it seems, I would love to read it below. Now this is what Patricia discovered. I went to Altamira to seek my dead. Not literally, although with what happened afterward, that phrase takes on a meaning that it did not have at that moment. I went because I had wanted to do it for years, and because at 51, one begins to understand that things that are indefinitely postponed end up never happening. I went because my mother, before she died, had spoken to me several times about that town, with a mix of nostalgia and something harder to name, something like guilt, or the relief of someone who left something behind and is not completely sure it was right to leave it. Altamira was the town where my maternal grandmother was born, and my grandmother's mother, and that mother's mother. A line of women who had lived in that place for generations until my grandmother left it at 20 with my grandfather and never returned. Never. In 50 years of adult life, my grandmother did not go back to Altamira even once. When we asked her why, she said there was nothing to see anymore, that everything that had been that place for her was left in the past, and that the past was better left undisturbed. I never understood that, until I went. Altamira was about 6 hours from the city where I live, by road. It was a medium-sized town by the standards of the region, with a central square, a colonial church, and a market on Sundays. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon in my own car, with a reservation at a small inn I had found online that had 3 stars and photographs showing clean rooms and a courtyard with flowers. What the photographs did not show was what I felt upon entering the town. It was nothing concrete. There was no visible sign, no sound, no particular smell. It was simply a feeling that the air changed upon crossing the boundary of the town. It became denser, quieter, like the air in a closed space that has been that way for a long time. And with that, a very slight discomfort that I attributed to the fatigue of the journey and the weight of being in a place that carried all the meaning I had given it before knowing it. I settled into the inn. The lady who managed it was named Doña Inés, a woman of about 65 years with her hair tied up and working hands. She asked me for my last name for the register, as is customary, and when I said it, she looked at me in a way that lasted barely a second but that I noticed. "Family from here?" she asked. "On my mother's side," I said. "My grandmother was from Altamira. She was born here." Doña Inés nodded and continued with the registration without saying anything else. That night I had dinner at a restaurant in the square and went to bed early. In the morning I planned to go to the civil registry to look for documents about my ancestors, and to the cemetery to find the graves of those who had lived in that town before me. I slept well that first night. No dreams, or at least none that I remembered upon waking. The civil registry opened at 9. The official who attended to me, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, searched the system for my grandmother's last name and then in the physical files, which for the older years were still on paper and not digital. He found records, several, spanning multiple generations. Births, marriages, deaths. I documented everything in a notebook, that chain of names and dates that builds the history of a family in a way that no family conversation ever fully captures. It was in one of those documents that I found the first thing I didn't expect. The death record of a woman who had died 120 years ago, my grandmother's grandmother, according to the chain I was reconstructing. The cause of death was noted in the formal handwriting of the records from that time. The official helped me read it because the paper was deteriorated and the writing was difficult. The cause of death noted was consumption by pact. I stared at that phrase. "What does that mean?" I asked the official. She read the document again, frowning. "I don't know," she said. "It's a rare notation. Normally at that time they would write disease, accident. This is unusual." I photographed the document and continued reviewing. In the cemetery that afternoon, I found the graves without much difficulty. They were in the oldest section, with stone tombstones that time had partially covered with lichen, and that had that appearance of things that have been waiting a long time for someone to visit them. I kept photographing them, reading the names, connecting the dates with what I had found in the civil registry. It was a quiet and somewhat emotional task. These were my dead, people I had not known but who were part of who I was. I arrived at the oldest grave I found with my last name, that of the woman whose death record said consumption by pact. The tombstone was simple, just the name and the dates, but it had something engraved underneath that the others didn't have. A small symbol at the bottom edge of the stone, partially covered by lichen. I carefully cleaned it with a damp cloth. It was a symbol I didn't recognize, with curved edges and lines that crossed in a way that wasn't decorative. It had the quality of symbols that mean something specific to those who know them and mean nothing to those who don't. I photographed it too. That night at the inn, reviewing the photos on my phone, I showed the symbol to Mrs. Inez, who was at the reception when I passed by. She looked at the photo for a moment. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "In a grave in the cemetery, my family." Mrs. Inez returned the phone to me. "How long are you staying?" she asked. "I was thinking of staying until Sunday," I said. She nodded slowly. "There is a woman in the village," she said. "Her name is Doña Remedios. She lives on the street that goes down to the river, the second house with a green gate. She knows about these things. If you want to understand what you found, go see her tomorrow." "What kind of things does she know?" "The ones from here," said Doña Inez. "The ones from this town in particular. I went to see Doña Remedios the next morning. She was an older woman who seemed to be older than she probably was, with that appearance that people sometimes have when they have carried heavy things for a long time. Her house was small and tidy and smelled of herbs I couldn't identify. She let me in without asking who I was or what I wanted, as if she were expecting me. I showed her the photo of the symbol on the tomb. Doña Remedios looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "What is your last name?" she asked. I told her. She nodded, with the expression of someone confirming something they already suspected. "Your family has a history in this town," she said. "Not all of it, but an important part. Do you know anything about it?" "Only that my grandmother left 50 years ago and never returned." "Your grandmother left because she knew," said Doña Remedios. "Or at least she suspected. The women in her family always knew, one way or another. The problem is that knowing is not enough to break what is done." "What is done?" Doña Remedios got up and went to a cupboard from which she took out a thick book with leather covers, which she placed on the table between the two of them. 140 years ago, he said, a woman from her family made a deal. I don't know the exact details. No one knows them entirely, but the outcome is documentable. From that deal, the female line of that family had certain things: prosperity, health. The daughters were born well, grew up well, lived well, for several generations. And the price? The price was that something would have the right to be close. Not inside, not controlling. Close. Observing. And every certain number of generations, claiming one. He fell silent for a moment. "Your grandmother's grandmother was the first to pay," he continued. "That's the one that says consumption by pact in the record. She died young, and in a way that the doctors of that time could not explain. After her, there were others. Not always deaths. Sometimes it was something different. One that got lost, one that went mad, one that disappeared without explanation. The chain continues." "Did my grandmother know?" "Her grandmother knew that if she stayed in Altamira, where the bond is anchored, the proximity was greater. That distancing does not break the bond but weakens it." Doña Remedios looked directly at me. "You came here, voluntarily, and you brought your surname with you." The silence that followed was heavy. "What does that mean?" I asked. "That what is anchored here recognized you when you entered the town," she said. "That now it knows you exist and where you are." "And what do I do?" Doña Remedios opened the thick book and searched through its pages until she reached a section marked with a piece of cloth. "There is a way to notify oneself," she said. "Not to break, as that would require things that are no longer available, but to establish that you came voluntarily, that you honored the debt with your presence, and that you can leave. Sometimes that is enough for the cycle not to advance upon you. Sometimes. I have no certainties," she said. "Just experience." We did what Doña Remedios indicated that afternoon. We returned to the cemetery, to the grave with the symbol. Doña Remedios brought things that I will not describe in detail because she asked me not to. What I can say is that something was said aloud directed at the stone, and that I repeated certain words when she indicated me to, and that at some point during that process, the temperature in that section of the cemetery dropped in a way that did not correspond to the wind or the shadow of any tree, and then it rose again, gradually, until it was the normal temperature of an October afternoon. Doña Remedio said it was enough. I stayed that night longer and left the next day, a Saturday, a day earlier than planned. On the way back, halfway through the route, I stopped to get gas. While I waited, I looked at my phone and found a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It just said, "You can leave now." There was no name. The number, when I tried to look it up later, didn't match any known contact. And when I tried to call it, the tone was of a non-existent line. I never found out who that message was from. I didn't ask either. I got home that night and called a cousin, the only relative from that line I have left, and I told her what I had found. Not everything, but enough. I told her I had information about the family, documents, photographs, that whenever she wanted, we could talk. My cousin listened in silence and finally said, "My mother always said that we shouldn't go to that town. And did you know why?" "Not exactly," she said. "But there are things you learn not to ask about." I keep thinking about that, about how much the women in my family knew that chose not to say anything, about whether the silence was a protection or if it was the silence that allowed the story to keep repeating itself without anyone interrupting it. I have no answer for that. What I do know is that since I returned from Altamira, something has changed. Not in the world outside, but in me. A kind of awareness that certain things exist and that ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. My grandmother knew it. That's why she left. I went, and I think I survived, I believe. This is where Patricia wanted to share. She told me that writing it took her months, that there were parts she didn't know how to put into words. She succeeded. If you have a family history that holds secrets that no one can fully explain, or if you ever went to search for your roots and found more than you expected, tell me in the comments. I love reading those stories. And if you stayed listening until now, subscribe. There are many more testimonies waiting. Rest well. We'll talk soon. Before this story, I want to tell you something. The testimonies that affect me the most are not those of monsters or dramatic apparitions. They are those of completely normal people who, at some ordinary moment in their lives, come across something that doesn't fit into any framework they know. Lucia wrote to me 3 weeks ago. She is an architect, works with plans and measurements and structural logic, and yet what she told me has no explanation that she can support. If you also have something like that stored away, something that doesn't add up and that you haven't been able to tell anyone, write to me. But now, join me inside a colonial building in the historic center, and to what Lucia found in the basement during a restoration that no one should have started. I have been working in the restoration of historic buildings for 15 years. It is a job that requires a particular way of seeing things. It is not enough to know about structures and materials, although that is the foundation. One must learn to read a building as one reads a text. Each layer of paint over another, each repair on top of a previous one, each modification that someone made at some point for a reason that the building still holds even though the person is no longer there. Old buildings have memory. I knew that since I started in this, and for 15 years it seemed to me a nice metaphor and nothing more. After the Carranza building, it stopped seeming like a metaphor. The Carranza building is in the historic center of the city, on a corner that has been called that since the 18th century, although the current building is from the 19th century. 4 floors, gray quarry facade, entrance hall with arches leading to an interior courtyard with a dry fountain. It had been at different times a family home, a minor convent, a warehouse, and government offices. When it was assigned to me, it had been abandoned for 12 years, with structural damage on the 3rd floor, and a basement that no one had catalogued because access was blocked by a partial collapse of the internal staircase. The task was to carry out a complete survey before deciding whether the building was restorable or if only the facade needed to be demolished and rebuilt. Routine work for someone with my experience. I assumed it would take me 2 weeks, 3 at most. I started on Monday. My assistant on that project was Camila, who had been working with me for 2 years and had that uncommon combination of technical precision and genuine curiosity that makes someone very good at restoration. Camila measured, photographed, and took notes with an efficiency that had earned my trust since the first project. We dedicated the first day to the exterior and the courtyard. The building was in better condition than I expected from the outside, The load-bearing walls were still solid, the humidity was manageable, and the damage on the third floor was localized. I began to think it would be a relatively clean restoration. At the end of that first day, while we were packing up the equipment in the courtyard, Don Heriberto appeared. He was a man of about 75 years, very thin, always wearing a white shirt, buttoned up to the collar regardless of the heat. He was the caretaker of the building, or had been for the last 20 years, a figure that the municipal agency managing the property had forgotten to remove when they abandoned the premises. Don Heriberto continued to come every day, sweeping the courtyard, keeping the entrances closed, living in the caretaker's room next to the hallway with a small stove and a bed. No one had evicted him because no one remembered he was there. He introduced himself very formally, told me he was the building manager, and then, without me asking anything, added, "You can't go down to the basement." I told him that the basement was part of the survey and that we needed to catalog it. Don Heriberto looked at me with small, very calm eyes, which do not betray urgency, even if they feel it, and said, "You don't go down to the basement. That has always been known here." I asked why. "Because it has an owner," he said, and didn't add anything else. That night I told Camila what the old man had said while we were reviewing the plans in my office. Camila smiled in her practical and affectionate way and said, "All old buildings have a man like that, who knows things no one asked him." She paused. "Are we going down to the basement tomorrow?" "The day after. First, let's finish the upper floors." We spent Tuesday and Wednesday on the upper floors. The third floor had the most severe damage. A sagging ceiling beam, dampness that had seeped in for years through a crack in the roof, some walls with cracks that required intervention, but nothing that couldn't be treated. Camila measured and I dictated, and the work progressed with that satisfying rhythm of things coming together as they should. On Thursday we reached the basement. The internal staircase that led down to the basement had partially collapsed, as previous reports had stated. The first 3 steps had given way, but further down the staircase remained intact. With a portable ladder, we salvaged the fallen section and descended. The basement was large, much more than the superficial plan suggested. It extended beneath the entire building in a series of chambers connected by low arches, with vaulted brick ceilings that moisture had darkened to nearly black. The floor was made of packed earth. The air was dense, with that particular smell of spaces that have been unventilated for decades. Old earth, damp wood, something mineral that I couldn't identify. We turned on the portable lights and began to work. The first chamber had nothing particular. Masonry walls, empty niches that had served for storage, a drainage channel in the center that no longer functioned. Camila measured and I took notes. Ordinary work. The second chamber was deeper, connected to the first by a low arch that forced one to bend down. There, the floor had something different. In the center, in an area of perhaps 2 meters in diameter, the floor was darker than the rest, with a different texture. As if at some remote time, there had been a hearth or something that burned regularly. I photographed that in detail, noted the dimensions, and moved on. The third chamber was at the back, separated from the second by another arch, this one smaller, barely 1.5 meters high. I had to bend down quite a bit to pass through. Camila entered behind me. This chamber was different from the other 2. It was smaller, almost circular, with a lower ceiling, and on the walls there were engravings. Not paintings, but engravings, lines traced directly into the stone with some sharp instrument, with a depth that spoke of patient and repeated work. The engravings covered all 4 walls from floor to ceiling, and although I did not recognize any writing system in them, I did recognize that they had an organization, that they were not random. There were figures that repeated, something that could be a tree, or could be a human figure with arms raised, something that could be an eye or could be a sun, and a smaller figure, repeated dozens of times in different sizes and positions, that I did not know what it was. Camila stood still beside me, looking at the walls. "Lucia," she said softly, for no apparent reason to lower her voice. "I see," I replied, also in a low voice. We photographed everything, every wall, every section, the details of the repeated figures. It took longer than expected because it was important material, the kind of finding that completely changes the approach to a restoration. We went up to the courtyard and found Don Heriberto sweeping by the fountain, as if he had been waiting for us. He looked at us when we came out and said, without any prior question, "You've seen the engravings." It wasn't a question. "Did you know they were there?" I asked him. "Everyone who has taken care of this building has seen them," Don Heriberto replied. He continued sweeping, long before I did, and everyone knew the same thing, that chamber is not to be touched. "What's in that chamber, Don Heriberto?" The old man stopped sweeping. He looked at me for a moment, then looked at Camila, and then looked back at me. "The one who takes care of the building," he said. "What do you mean by that?" Don Heriberto leaned the broom against the wall of the fountain with a calmness that contrasted with the weight of what he was saying. "When they built this building, or when they built what was there before the building, they made a deal." He paused. "Someone who lived in that place before there was a city wanted to stay there, and those who built on top let him stay, in exchange for taking care of the building." Another pause. "What is in that chamber is not a ghost, it is not a dead person, it is something that has always been there and has been taking care of this place for centuries." Camila and I looked at each other. "A goblin?" Camila asked, with a mix of curiosity and skepticism that was very much her. Don Heriberto twisted his mouth a bit, as if considering whether that word was appropriate. "Something like that," he finally said. "Although that name comes from children's stories and what is down there is much older than any story." That afternoon, back in my office, I searched for historical references about the Carranza building. I found what is usually found in the archives of colonial buildings: property records, transfers, some partial plans from the 19th century. But I also found something I didn't expect. A marginal note in an inventory from 1887, written in small handwriting and faded ink, which said, "The bottom basement is not to be intervened. Condition of the property since foundation." Since foundation. No further explanation. I slept poorly that night, not because I was exactly afraid, but because I had too many questions and no satisfactory answers, and that combination always keeps me awake. On Friday, I returned to the building alone before Camila arrived. I wanted to speak with Don Heriberto without an audience, with more time and more calm. I found him in the doorman's little room, drinking coffee from a tin cup. I invited him to talk, and he nodded without surprise. We sat in the courtyard, with the morning still cool, and the city beginning to wake up outside the walls. I asked him everything I wanted to know. Don Heriberto responded patiently, with the calmness of someone who has had a long time to organize what he knows and is willing to share it with anyone who is willing to listen. He told me that his predecessor, the caretaker before him, had explained the rules of the building on the first day of work, just as his had explained them to him. An oral transmission chain that Don Heriberto did not know how many generations it had. The rules were simple. Do not go down to the bottom basement, except to ensure that everything is in order. Do not move or touch the engravings. Do not bring metal objects to the bottom basement, especially tools. And once a month, on the night of the new moon, leave an offering at the entrance of the third chamber. Bread, a little salt, clean water. "Have you done it?" I asked him. "The monthly offering." "Since the first day," Don Heriberto said without hesitation. 20 years. "And have you seen anything? Have you ever seen what is in that chamber?" The old man took a moment before answering. "Once," he said. "Years ago, when I was just starting out. I went down to leave the offering and took longer than usual because I tripped in the dark." He paused. "When I turned on the flashlight, I saw something in the arch of the third chamber, at the threshold." "What did you see?" Don Heriberto clasped his hands over his knees. "Something small." Another pause. "Like a child. But it wasn't a child. The proportions were wrong. The arms too long, the head too big, and the eyes." He stopped. The eyes were the only thing that shone with the flashlight, like a cat's eyes in the dark, but in a color I couldn't name. "What did you do?" "I put the offering on the ground as quickly as I could and went back up." Don Heriberto looked at me. "And I never went back down to leave the offering at night again. Since then I leave it at noon." "Did you see it again?" "No. But sometimes when the building is very quiet, you can hear something. Small footsteps in the basement, or something moving between the rooms." A pause. "But that tells me it's still there, that it's still watching over." I asked him what it meant for it to watch over. if anyone had seen concrete evidence of that. Don Heriberto nodded slowly. "This building has been abandoned for 12 years, he said. Without maintenance, without intervention. The stone facade is perfect. The load-bearing walls have no structural damage. The roof has withstood 12 years without anyone checking it." He looked at me. "Have you seen abandoned buildings for 12 years in this climate?" I had seen it. Buildings that in 5 years without maintenance turned into ruins. The Carranza building, after 12 years of abandonment, was in a condition that I had considered surprisingly good on the first day. I didn't respond, but I thought about it. Camila arrived mid-morning, and we worked the rest of the day in the first 2 levels of the basement, carefully cataloging but without approaching the 3rd chamber. I had decided not to go back in there without knowing exactly for what and with what. It was that afternoon, almost at the end of the day, when the first thing happened. We were in the 2nd chamber, Camila measuring the drainage channel, and I was checking the masonry of the north wall. The portable light was between the two, casting a stable white light over the space. The light went out. There was no electrical failure, no prior flicker. It simply went out, abruptly, and we were left in total darkness. Total darkness in a basement is different from any other kind of darkness. There is no residual light source, no reflection from any origin. It is a complete denial of vision, so absolute that the brain starts to construct images where there is nothing. Camila said my name in the darkness. "Here I am," I said. "Don't move. I'm going to turn on the phone." I turned on the phone's flashlight. The portable light was on the ground between the two of us. Off. I bent down, picked it up, checked the button. It turned on without any problem. Camila looked at me with an expression that I described to myself as cautiously calm. "Did it fall?" she asked. "It was on the tripod," I said. "The tripod is still standing." We looked at the tripod. It was exactly where we had placed it, stable, with no visible reason for the focus to have separated from it. "Maybe the connection," Camila said. I checked the connection. It was firm. We didn't say anything else. We finished what was left and went upstairs. That night I told Camila what Don Heriberto had said about the rules and the offering. Camila listened without interrupting, with that expression of hers of someone processing information before giving an opinion. When I finished, she said, "Are we bringing metal tools to the basement today?" I thought. "The steel meter," I said. Camila nodded slowly. One of the rules was not to bring metal. I didn't respond to that immediately. Then I said, "I'm not saying we believe in this." "No," Camila said, "but I'm also not saying we shouldn't take it into account." The following Monday, before going down to the basement, I left at the entrance of the 3rd chamber what Don Heriberto had described to me. Bread, salt, water in a small container. I felt ridiculous doing it, but I did it. Camila was behind me and said nothing. We worked that week without incidents. The lights didn't go out again. The work progressed well. I began to get used to the peculiarity of the place, with that gradual adaptation that humans have to normalize almost anything if the exposure is continuous enough. But on Wednesday of that week, something happened that I couldn't normalize. It was 3 in the afternoon. Camila had gone up to get more batteries for the spare flashlights, and I was alone in the 2nd chamber reviewing some notes. The basement was silent, with that silence of underground spaces that absorb sound in a way different from surface spaces. And then I heard it. It came from the direction of the 3rd chamber, from the low arch that connected the 2nd with the 3rd. It was a small sound, almost delicate, like footsteps. Footsteps of something walking on the ground, slow, unhurried, not like rat footsteps, which are quick and random. They were slow and deliberate steps, with a rhythm that had something almost reflective. I stood completely still, listening. The footsteps reached the arch and stopped. I directed the flashlight towards the arch, only darkness beyond the reach of the light, and then, at the exact boundary where the light from my flashlight ended and the darkness of the 3rd chamber began, I saw the eyes, exactly as Don Heriberto had described them. 2 small points of light, at a height of perhaps 1 meter and 20 from the ground, shining with that reflection that certain animals' eyes have in the dark, but in a color that was neither green nor red, nor any color I could name precisely. Something between amber and something darker, something that had no reference in my previous visual experience. I did not move. The eyes did not move either. We looked at each other, if you can call that looking. for what seemed to me like several seconds, and in that time, without being able to explain where that certainty came from, I felt that what was watching me from the darkness was not hostile, it was not threatening, it was simply something that was evaluating, calibrating, deciding. Then the eyes disappeared, without visible movement, without sound. They simply stopped being. When Camilla came down with the batteries, I found her sitting on the floor of the second room with her back against the wall, the flashlight pointing at the arch, and an expression that she later told me she had never seen me have. I told her what I had seen. Camilla sat next to me against the same wall, and was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think it's what Don Heriberto said?" "I don't know what I think," I said honestly. "But it didn't do anything to you?" "No." Another silence. "The building is in very good condition," Camilla said, and in her voice there was something that was not exactly fear, but a kind of careful consideration. "For 12 years of abandonment." "I know." We finished the work for that day and went upstairs. As we passed by the arch of the third chamber, I did not look inside. I don't know if Camilla did. In the following days, I finished the survey. My final report to the municipal agency recommended the complete restoration of the building with specific conditions. The basement could be catalogued and preserved as a space of archaeological value, but the third chamber had to remain closed to the public and without any intervention of any kind. I justified that recommendation with technical arguments about the fragility of the engravings and the structural risk, which were valid arguments, even though they were not the real ones. The recommendation was accepted. I told Don Heriberto that the building was going to be restored and that it would probably need an official caretaker during and after the process. I asked him if he wanted to continue in that role. He looked at me with that calmness of his and said, "I'll stay as long as I can. Someone has to know the rules." I asked him if he thought that what was happening in the third chamber would still be there during and after the restoration. Don Heriberto thought for a moment. "It's been there since before there was a building," he said. "A restoration isn't going to move it." I finished the project 3 weeks after starting it. The Carranza building was declared a candidate for priority restoration and entered a process that, according to the usual timelines of the organization, would take between 2 and 4 years to begin. I returned to my other projects, but there is something I haven't been able to let go of since then. Something I wonder every time I pass through the historic center and see the gray stone facade of the Carranza building on its corner. On my last day there before leaving, I went down to the basement one more time, alone. I reached the arch of the second chamber and stood there, without a flashlight on, in the darkness, for a moment, and I said, in a normal voice, as one speaks to someone in the same room, "The building is going to be restored. The third chamber will not be touched. The rules remain." Silence. And then, from the darkness of the arch, the sound of something moving. Small deliberate steps retreating toward the back of the third chamber. I didn't see the eyes that time, but I heard it move away, and something in that sound, in that quiet and unhurried retreat, gave me the feeling that whatever was down there had understood. Or maybe it simply continued doing what it had always done, which is to take care. That was 8 months ago. The restoration of the Carranza building has not yet begun. Don Heriberto is still there, sweeping the courtyard, leaving the offering every new moon, taking care of what he has been taking care of for decades. And the third chamber remains closed. For now, that's the only thing I can say with certainty. And that's where what Lucia wanted to tell me ends. She told me that she still passes by the Carranza building from time to time, that she looks at the facade from the sidewalk and thinks about what is underneath, in that third chamber with its engraved walls and its eyes in the darkness. What stuck with me the most from her story is this, that there are things that did not come after us, but were there before, and learned to coexist with what came on top. If this story made you think of something, I would love to read it in the comments. And if you have a story of your own waiting to be told, you know there's a place for that here. Take care. We'll talk soon. There are people who write to me asking that I do not reveal their full name, and there are others who specifically ask me to do so, who want their story to circulate with their name because they feel it gives them a bit of control over something that took away a lot from them. Marcos is one of the latter. He is 52 years old, a musician, and lives in Buenos Aires. He wrote to me 3 weeks ago with a story that, in his own words, he has been carrying alone for 8 years. If you have ever had something to carry alone for too long, you already know how heavy that is. Marcos talks about a violin, about what he found inside that violin, and about what came with it to his apartment one night in March 8 years ago and took much longer to leave. This is what he told me. I have been playing the violin since I was 9 years old. I'm not saying this to show off or to establish credentials. I'm saying it because it's important to understand that I know the instruments in the way one knows things they've had in their hands for decades. I know their weight, their temperature, the specific sound each one makes when you tune it and when you detune it, the way the varnish ages, and the way the wood responds to the climate. I've held violins from the 18th century and violins made the previous week, and I can tell you differences that aren't written in any manual but in the tips of my fingers. With that experience, I arrived at the San Telmo Instrument Fair on a Saturday in March, with no particular plan other than to look, and I came home with the Guarneri. That's what I called it from the beginning, even though it wasn't a Guarneri. It was impossible for it to be a Guarneri. An instrument from that maker is worth what I won't earn in several years of work, and what the man selling it asked for was an amount I could pay without my hand trembling. But it had something in the wood that reminded me of the Guarneris I had been lucky enough to see up close during my years of study. A depth in the tone of the varnish, an asymmetry in the F-holes that seemed made by someone who understood that calculated imperfection is its own kind of perfection. I asked the seller where it came from. He said he had received it as part of payment for something, that he didn't know its history, and that if I wanted it, I could buy it, and if not, I could leave it. I bought it. The man didn't give me a case. The violin was wrapped in a dark, soft cloth, the kind used for old instruments. I unwrapped it right there to check it. The wood was in good condition, the pegs responded well, the bridge was slightly crooked, but it was a minor adjustment. There was something inside. I saw it when I tilted the instrument towards the light. A paper, folded, wedged behind the soundbar. I tried to pull it out with my fingers but couldn't. The seller, who had already forgotten about me, glanced at me for a second when I tilted it. I asked him if he knew what that paper was. He said, "I didn't take it out. You do whatever you want." I took the violin home. That night, with good light and a long watchmaker's tweezers, I pulled out the paper. It was a document. Handwritten, in a script I would recognize as from the early 20th century, if not earlier, in Spanish with some words that are no longer used, or that are used differently. It had no date. It was signed with a name I will not repeat here because there are things I learned that are better left unspoken or unwritten. It was a kind of declaration that the author, the signer, ceded something to the instrument. His words were confusing in parts, but the general sense was that a delivery, something given in exchange for something received. The last line said, and these I copy exactly because they are etched in my mind: "What lives in the wood is mine as long as I live. When I am no longer here, it is yours. May he who touches it know that he is not alone." I kept the paper. I told myself it was a historical curiosity, the kind of thing an eccentric musician from another century had tucked inside his instrument as an artistic statement or as a private joke. I went to sleep. That night I dreamed of music. It was not a melody I knew or had composed. It was something that came from outside the dream, if that makes sense. A music that I heard but did not play, that arrived from somewhere behind the images of the dream like a separate audio track. It was beautiful, I must say, in a way that generated something between admiration and discomfort, like the beauty of certain things that one senses they shouldn't find beautiful. I woke up at 3 in the morning. The apartment was silent. I poured myself some water in the kitchen, and on my way back to the bedroom, I passed through the living room where I had left the violin on the dining table. I stopped. The violin was in the same place where I had left it, but the pegs were in different positions. Not all of them, just 2, the E and A. I had tuned them that afternoon, and now they were moved. Not much, but enough for the tuning to be slightly altered. I told myself that the changes in nighttime temperature could move the pegs of an old instrument. It's true that this happens. I told myself it was that. I went back to bed. I closed my eyes. And I heard, for perhaps 2 seconds from the living room, a note. Just one. Long, sustained in the register of E. I remained motionless for several minutes. Not repeated, just that note. suspended in the silence of the apartment, and then nothing. The next day I called my daughter Rebecca. She lives alone a few blocks from my apartment, and we often work together. Her as a pianist, me as a violinist, in small ensembles and private events. I told her about the new violin, the paper inside, the note from the night. She listened to me with the mix of affection and impatience she uses when she thinks I'm being dramatic. She told me that the note was probably a contraction of the wood, that old papers inside instruments were more common than they seemed, and that if the instrument sounded good, I should take advantage of it. I agreed with her. We hung up, but I started playing the violin that very afternoon, and what came out stopped me. It was perfect, and that, for someone who has been playing for more than 4 decades, has a specific meaning. It's not that I play poorly, it's not false modesty, but there is a level of technique where one knows exactly the limits of their own hands, what they can produce and what they cannot. And that day, with that instrument, I was producing something that was beyond my usual limits. Passages that normally took me effort were flowing out with a fluency that wasn't mine. Nuances that took me years to develop were coming effortlessly, without thinking about them. It was as if the instrument knew where I wanted to go before I even decided. I played for 3 straight hours. When I stopped, I realized that I hadn't stopped out of exhaustion, but because something inside the instrument, or inside me, or in both, decided that it was enough for that day. That feeling, that the decision wasn't entirely mine, was the first thing that caused me real and sustained discomfort. During the following week, I played every day. The music that came out was still extraordinary. I began to compose pieces that surprised me while I played them, as if I were receiving them instead of creating them. In the 30 years I've been composing, I had never experienced anything like this with such consistency. Music that arrived complete, without the construction work that it normally implies, without the versions and corrections and discards. It just arrived, and it was good. It was better than anything I had done before. But the apartment was starting to feel different. It's hard to describe accurately. It wasn't that something had changed physically. The furniture was in its place. The temperature was normal. There were no strange smells or noises. It was something more in the atmosphere, in the quality of the air, like when you enter a room where 2 people have just had a tense conversation and have already left. The furniture is there, the chair is there, but something of the exchange lingers in the space. That's how my apartment felt, as if there was always someone who had just left or was about to enter. Celso, my neighbor from downstairs, rang my doorbell one Tuesday morning. He was a man in his 60s, retired, calm, the kind of neighbor you have for years without knowing his name and then discover he is the most reasonable person in the building. He told me he wanted to tell me something but didn't know how I would take it. I told him to go ahead. He said that the night before, around 2 in the morning, he had heard music, violin, coming from my apartment. And it was beautiful, he clarified. He wasn't complaining about the noise, but he wanted to know if I was okay because there was something in that music that had kept him from sleeping, not because of the volume, but because of the feeling it gave him, like listening to something one shouldn't be listening to. I told him I hadn't played anything the night before, that I'd gone to bed at 11 and hadn't gotten up. Celso looked at me for a moment and then said, "Then maybe it was something else." He didn't clarify what he meant by that and left. That night I put the violin inside the case I had bought for it and carefully closed the zipper, placing it at the back of the bedroom closet. I told myself I needed to keep it away for a few days, that perhaps I was spending too many hours playing, and that was affecting my perception of things. I went to bed early. At 1:45 in the morning, I was awakened by the music. It was the violin. I recognized it immediately because it was my instrument, my sound, and because the piece being played was one of those I had composed that week. The case was closed. I heard it clearly from the bedroom. The bow on the strings, the nuances, the changes in position. It was perfect. The same perfection I produced when I played it during the day, but with something additional that I couldn't name until later. An element in the sound that wasn't technical but of another nature, as if someone were playing with an emotion that the human body doesn't exactly produce. I got up. I opened the closet. The case was closed. The music continued. I opened the case. The violin was there, still, with the bow beside it. The music stopped at the exact moment I opened the case. Not at the end of a phrase, not with a cadence, in the middle of a note. I sat on the bedroom floor with the open case in front of me for a time I couldn't measure. Then I called Rebecca. It was 2 in the morning. She answered scared because I never call at that hour. I told her I needed her to come. She asked what was wrong. I didn't know exactly what to say. I told her the violin plays by itself. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then she said, "I'm coming." Rebecca arrived in 20 minutes. She checked the case, checked the violin, checked the apartment with that mix of worry and skepticism that she has. She didn't hear anything that night. She stayed until 4 in the morning and left convinced that I had dreamed the music or that the sound was coming from some other floor of the building. I told her it was fine. I was left alone. I spent the following days trying to document what was happening. I recorded with my phone for several nights. In 3 of the recordings there is something, not complete music but loose, brief notes, the kind one would produce if passing the bow with very little pressure on the strings. But the bow was in the case. I checked it every morning. The case was always closed. The violin was always inside. The more intense dreams also began. It was no longer just background music. Now there was a figure in the dreams, always on the periphery, always turned away or in profile, never facing forward. They wore dark clothing from another era. They had a violin under their arm. And in the dreams I knew, with that irrational certainty of dreams, that this figure had been the previous owner of the instrument. Not the seller at the fair, the true owner, the signer of the paper. I went to see Father Ignacio. I am not a practitioner. My relationship with the church is that of someone who went to Mass as a child and then drifted away without drama or resentment. But Father Ignacio was an elderly priest whom I had known for years through a mutual friend, and he was known to be someone who listened without judging the stories that other priests dismissed. I went to his church one Wednesday afternoon and found him organizing books in the sacristy. I asked him for a moment. He gave it to me. I told him everything. The paper inside the violin, the text of the declaration, the nighttime music, the dreams, the figure. Father Ignacio listened without interrupting me even once. When I finished, he closed the book he had in his hands and asked me, "Did you play that instrument after reading the paper?" I told him yes. He nodded slowly as if that confirmed something he already suspected. He told me that what I was describing had characteristics of what in certain traditions is called an invocation bond by object. Someone had made a pact that tied a presence to that instrument with specific conditions of transfer, and by playing the violin I had activated that bond unknowingly. He told me that it was not necessarily a malevolent presence, that such pacts were sometimes made for reasons that the signer considered legitimate, often related to talent, with the desire to continue something beyond death. But that such a bond had consequences that accumulated over time, that the presence began to take up space, that the object became a door always ajar. I asked him what I could do. He thought for a moment. Then he asked me if I had the paper. I told him yes, that I had kept it. He told me to bring the paper and the violin, that there was a way to close that bond, which involved a blessing of the instrument and the destruction of the paper, but that for it to work I had to make a decision, that if we closed the bond, the instrument would become just an instrument again, that the perfection I had experienced while playing it would leave with its presence. That part cost me more than I expected. Spending a week playing with that quality, producing that music, had left a mark. It was like having tasted something and knowing that when you returned it, you wouldn't forget the flavor. I told Father Ignacio that I needed to think about it. He said he understood, but that I shouldn't wait too long, that bonds of that kind tended to deepen over time. I returned to the apartment. I sat in front of the closed case for a long time. I thought about the signer of the paper, about what he had wanted, for his music to continue, for what lived in the wood not to die with him. I thought that in a way he had succeeded, that I had played his music, that I had heard it in dreams, that somehow he had managed to have someone else receive it. But I also thought about Celso, who had not been able to sleep, about Rebecca, who had come scared at 2 in the morning, about the nights I had spent awake listening, about the feeling that my apartment had an occupant that I had not invited. I went to Father Ignacio the next day with the paper and the violin. The process seemed simple. A prayer, holy water over the instrument, the paper burned in a metal bowl while Father Ignacio recited something in Latin that I couldn't follow. It lasted perhaps 20 minutes. The paper took a while to burn. The flame flickered on and off several times before it held, which Father Ignacio observed without comment, but with visible attention. When the paper finished burning, he returned the violin to me, told me to take care of it, that it was a beautiful instrument, and that if he noticed anything again, I should let him know. I returned to the apartment. That night I slept without dreams, or if there were any, I don't remember them. The apartment felt different. That residue of presence that I had learned to recognize was no longer there. It was simply my apartment, with the normal silence of a fifth-floor flat in the early morning and the distant traffic of the avenue. The next day I took the violin and played. It was a good instrument, better than most I have had, but that was all it was, an instrument. The supernatural perfection of the previous week was not there. My hands were my hands, with their known limitations and their technique built over decades. I played for an hour and what came out was good, solid, mine. I stared at the violin when I finished, with a feeling that took me a while to identify but that I could ultimately only describe as mourning. A small, private, somewhat absurd mourning for something I should never have wanted to keep. I still keep the violin. I play with it at some concerts. No one who listens to me notices any difference with my other instruments. And I play well, as I have always played, as I learned to play over 40 years. But sometimes, very occasionally, on winter nights when the apartment is completely silent, I think I hear something. Not music, just a presence in the air, brief, like someone passing through a hallway without stopping. And I don't know if it's an echo of what was there, or if Father Ignacio was right that what we did was enough to close the door, or if there are doors that can be closed but not completely sealed. That's what I have to share. The violin is fine, I am fine. And that music I received that week, that music that came without asking for it, I wrote it all down before returning it. It's kept in my notebook. I play it from time to time, with my hands and my limits, and without anyone's help. I guess I had to hold on to something. End of Marcos's testimony. He told me at the end of his message that the notebook with those compositions really exists, and that someday he might record them, and that when he does, he won't be able to avoid thinking about who really composed them. What stays with me most from his story is that question he asks himself at the end, whether there are doors that close completely or if there is always a crack left. I have no answer to that. But if you ever had an object that you felt carried something more than its physical weight, I would love for you to share it with me in the comments. Every story you share reminds me that there is so much we still cannot name. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. I want to warn you about something before this story begins. There are testimonies that come to this channel that generate a very specific feeling in me when I read them. Something between unease and recognition, as if the person writing had touched something real that they shouldn't have touched. Camila, a university student from Bogota, sent me this account in 3 parts, over 3 different nights, as if she needed to take breaks to continue writing. If you enjoy this type of stories and you are not yet subscribed to the channel, now is a good time to do so. There are new stories every week. Now, listen to what happened to Camila when she started to investigate who had lived before her in her apartment, and why the 4th floor of that building had been vacant for years. She was 24 years old when all this happened, and had just begun her last year of university. I studied social communication, and at that time I was living with Renata, a classmate, in a 4th floor apartment of a 1950s building in downtown Bogota. It was an old building but well maintained, one of those with a metal gate elevator and worn marble stairs that creak on the middle steps. The kind of building that has character, that feels different from modern blocks without texture or history. Renata and I had been living there for a year when things started happening. A quiet year, with nothing out of the ordinary, following the usual routine of 2 students sharing space. Classes, assignments, long nights before exams, weekends of rest. The apartment we occupied was 401, the first one on the 4th floor as you exit the elevator. The 4th floor corridor had 4 apartments, 401 ours, 402 next door, 403 at the far left, and 404 at the far right. Apartments 402 and 403 were occupied by neighbors I greeted but with whom I had no further dealings, an elderly lady in 402 and a young couple in 403. Apartment 404 was empty. Not just empty in the sense of temporarily unoccupied. Empty in a way that I noticed from the first day I moved in, without knowing exactly what it was that I was noticing. 404 always had its door closed with an additional lock, no doormat outside, no signs of life or traffic. and the corridor around that door felt different from the rest of the hallway. Colder, always, even though the other doors were closed too. A very specific localized cold that disappeared a few steps away from 404. I noticed it and ignored it. We had many things to think about. The first time I asked the doorman about 404 was about 3 months after we moved in, casually, one morning when I went down to pick up a package. Mr. Heriberto was the doorman of the building, a man in his 80s, thin and quiet, who had been in that building for decades, and knew it like one knows an extension of one's own body. He was kind but terse, with short answers and an evaluative gaze. I asked him if 404 had been vacant for a long time. Mr. Heriberto looked at me for a moment before answering. "A long time," he said. "Why don't they rent it out?" Another pause. "The owner prefers to keep it that way." I didn't ask any more questions, but something in his tone in that pause before answering lingered vaguely in my mind in the following days. The topic of 404 came back to my mind a month later when Renata mentioned something during dinner. "Have you noticed the smell sometimes in the hallway?" she asked. "What smell?" "Like flowers, but old flowers, like the ones they put on altars. Incense, perhaps, or something similar." I thought about it. Yes, I had noticed it, although I hadn't consciously paid attention. A sweet and dense smell that sometimes appeared in the hallway on the 4th floor with no apparent source and disappeared just as quickly. "Where do you think it comes from?" I asked. Renata shrugged, but looked at me with that expression of hers when something bothers her more than she wants to admit. "From 404, I suppose. Although if it's empty, I don't understand how." We didn't say more about the topic that night, but something had opened up between us. A shared awareness of the back apartment that until that moment, each of us had processed in silence. The following week, while Renata was in class and I had the apartment to myself, I did something that in retrospect I shouldn't have done. I went to the hallway and stopped in front of the door of 404. It was a dark wooden door, thicker than the other doors in the hallway, with 2 locks instead of 1. The paint was in good condition, which meant someone was maintaining it even though no one lived inside. There was no mail slot. The absent doormat had left a rectangular mark on the hallway floor, slightly darker than the rest of the marble. I crouched down and tried to look through the lower keyhole. I saw nothing. Either the lock was blocked from the inside or there simply wasn't enough light on the other side. I stood up and placed my palm against the door. The wood was cold, much colder than the air in the hallway, which was already cooler than the rest of the floor. A chill that came from inside, as if on the other side of that door there was a space kept at a consistently lower temperature than anything the building's physics could explain. And then I heard something. It was very soft, almost imperceptible, and lasted only a few seconds. A sound coming from inside the apartment, like the brushing of fabric against the floor, like someone moving very slowly in a silent space. A movement, deliberate and slow. I withdrew my hand from the door and walked away from there with steps quicker than I would have liked to acknowledge. That afternoon I told Renata what I had heard. She listened to me with the expression of someone who wants to be rational but struggles to do so in light of certain details. "Camila," she said, "don't do that again." "Why?" "Because there are reasons why that apartment is closed, and they don't concern us. And because meddling in other people's doors in old buildings leads to nothing good." I listened to her. For a week, I kept away from the corridor more than necessary. I entered and exited our apartment without stopping. I looked down when I passed in front of 404, but I kept thinking, that's my nature. I can't leave a mystery without trying to understand it. I study communication precisely because I am fascinated by research, finding the stories that lie beneath the visible stories. And 404 was a story that lay beneath something. I felt it with a certainty that I couldn't rationalize but also couldn't ignore. I started indirectly. I went to the building administration, which was on the 1st floor, and asked the lady at the desk if they had any information about the history of apartment 404, under the pretext that I was doing a university project on historical residential architecture in Bogota. The lady looked at me with an expression that mixed kindness and something harder to read. "That apartment is not available for visits," she said. "I don't want to visit it. Just historical information. Who lived there? How long has it been vacant?" The lady typed something on her computer and spent a moment looking at the screen. The apartment 404 has been unleased since 1987, she finally said. The owner has renewed the management contract every year, but without leasing authorization. Do you know why? Another evaluative look. You would have to ask the owner directly. I couldn't contact the owner. The administration didn't give me their details. But the dates stuck with me. Since 1987. 30-something years with that apartment empty, paying administration fees, renewing contracts, without renting or selling it. That wasn't just negligence or disinterest. It was an active decision to keep it that way. I told Renata that night. Since 1987, she repeated. That's before both of us were born. Exactly. Something happened there. Or someone doesn't want anything else to happen, Renata said, with a logic that seemed more disturbing than mine. I decided to search in another way. I had access to the university's newspaper archive, where Bogota newspapers had been digitized from decades ago. I spent 2 afternoons looking for any note related to the building's address. I found it in a newspaper from October 1987. It was a small note, half a column without a photo. He was talking about the death of a woman in an apartment in the building, a lady with the last name Castaño, whose death had been classified as natural, but had generated some attention because the woman lived alone and had gone several days before anyone noticed her absence. The note did not give the apartment number, but it did give the floor, the 4th. I searched more. In another newspaper, a week later, I found a letter to the editor, one of those that readers used to send at that time, which mentioned the building obliquely and spoke of inappropriate practices that supposedly Mrs. Castaño had carried out in her apartment for years, and that according to the author of the letter were known in the building, although no one officially reported them. The letter did not specify what kind of practices, but it used a word that made me stare at the screen for a good while. The word invocations. That night I did not sleep well. I showed the clippings to Renata the next day. She read them silently, with that expression of internal processing that I knew well. Camila, she said when she finished, I'm going to ask you something. What? To stop here. To not keep searching. Why? Because there's a difference between understanding something and getting involved. We've understood enough. There's a dead woman in that apartment for 30 years, or at least something related to her, and the owner of the apartment made the decision to keep it closed, probably for reasons we don't need to know in detail. I looked at her. Have you felt something too? I asked. Not just the smell, something more. Renata took a moment. Sometimes at night, I hear something in the hallway. Steps. Very slow. That stop in front of our door. I was frozen. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want you to do exactly what you're doing. I had 3 days of forced calm during which I tried to follow Renata's advice. I went to classes, worked on my projects, had a normal dinner, and slept reasonably. But 404 was still there, at the end of the hallway, and I was still the person who can't leave a mystery untouched. On the 4th night I broke. It was 1 a.m, Renata was asleep, and I was awake with the laptop when I heard what Renata had described. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured, with that particular rhythm that footsteps have when someone is not in a hurry because they have nowhere to go. I got up. I put on my shoes. I opened the apartment door carefully enough not to make a sound. The hallway was empty and dark, illuminated only by the emergency light at the end. The smell of old flowers was present with an intensity it hadn't had before, dense, almost physical, as if the air itself were impregnated, and the door to 404 was ajar, not completely open, just a few centimeters, enough for a faint, yellowish, flickering strip of light to escape through the crack, like that of a candle. I stood frozen in the doorway of our apartment for what must have been several seconds. My brain was processing what my eyes were seeing with that slowness that comes when reality does not fit any known category. The door that was always locked with a double lock was open. There was light inside. There was someone inside. I walked toward 404. I know I shouldn't have done it. I know it clearly now, and on some level, I knew it at that moment. But there is something about certain thresholds, something in the combination of darkness and light and smell and the particular silence of dawns that suspends ordinary judgment and replaces it with something more akin to inevitable attraction. I reached the door of 404 and pushed it very gently. It opened without resistance. What I saw inside, I won't be able to describe with the precision I would like. because there are parts that my memory registered in a fragmented way, as happens with things that the brain doesn't have the category to archive completely. The apartment was large, larger than I expected, with high ceilings and walls that must have been white but were covered, from floor to ceiling, with something that took me a moment to identify: papers. Hundreds of papers stuck to the walls, covered in handwriting, tight and small, in ink that seemed dark, but in the candlelight, which burned in chandeliers distributed throughout the space, had a tone I don't want to describe in more detail. The floor was covered with drawings made with something in powder, circles and lines that formed complex geometric patterns that spread across the entire surface of the apartment. There were objects in the center of the patterns, things I couldn't name, shapes that didn't correspond to anything I could easily categorize. And in the center of the apartment, with its back to me, there was a figure. It was a woman. Or she had the shape of a woman, tall, with long white hair completely loose that reached her waist, dressed in something dark and without a defined shape. She was standing still in the center of the floor patterns, with her arms slightly separated from her body. She hadn't moved when I opened the door. She didn't turn when I entered. But I knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than reasoning, that she knew I was there. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice sounded strange in that space, crushed, as if the air absorbed the sound instead of transmitting it. The figure did not respond, but slowly, with a slowness that did not correspond to any human movement I had seen, she began to turn. I didn't get to see her face. Something grabbed my arm from behind with a strength I didn't expect, and pulled me into the hallway. Renata, with her hair down and her eyes wide open, had an expression on her face that I had never seen in the year we had been living together. She pulled me into the hallway and slammed the door of 404 shut. "Camilla," she said in a whisper that was almost a shout. "Camilla, don't look back. Just walk." I walked. We entered our apartment. Renata locked the door, put on the chain, and stood with her back against the door looking at me. "What did you see?" I asked. "Enough to never open that door again," she said. "Renata, what did you see?" She took a moment. "I saw that he was turning around, and I saw that you were standing still. That was enough. That night we didn't sleep. We sat in the living room with all the lights on until dawn. The next morning I went down to talk to Don Heriberto. No beating around the bush, no excuses. I went straight to the point. Don Heriberto, last night the door to 404 was open, and there was someone inside. The doorman looked at me for a very long moment. "Did you see anything?" he asked. "Yes." Don Heriberto nodded very slowly, with the expression of someone who has waited for this moment for a long time, and doesn't quite know how to handle it now that it has arrived. "Mrs. Castaño lived in that apartment for 40 years, he said. When she died, the apartment was left in the name of her nephew, who lives abroad. The nephew has never come to Colombia, but he has neither sold nor rented the apartment. When I asked him why, many years ago, he told me that his aunt had asked him to leave it as it was, that there were things in there that could not be moved or disturbed." "What kind of things?" Don Heriberto chose his words carefully. Mrs. Castaño was a woman who knew how to do things. She wasn't a bad person, that must be said. She was a quiet, polite neighbor who never caused problems. But she knew how to do things that most people don't know how to do. And for 40 years, she did those things in that apartment. When she died, what she had put in that space didn't leave with her. "And the door? How was it open?" Mr. Heriberto looked at me directly. "Sometimes it opens. Not often. But sometimes. As if what's inside wants someone to see it. Or as if Mrs. Castaño still wanted to receive visitors. That same afternoon, Renata and I started looking for another apartment. We left a month later. We didn't say anything to the neighbors or the management about what we had seen because we didn't know how to say it or if there was anything to say that would change things. The building is still there. Apartment 404 is still closed, I suppose, or open depending on what decides what lives inside. I never got to see the face of the figure that was turning. Renata says it's the best thing that could have happened to me. I don't know if I agree. Sometimes I think a part of me still wants to know what I would have seen. And that part worries me more than anything else. That's all Camilla wanted to share. That's what she sent me over 3 nights, in 3 parts, as if she needed to take a breath between each one. Camilla wrote to me that she finished her degree, that she now works at a digital magazine, and that she never returned to that neighborhood in downtown Bogota. She says there are streets that one decides not to cross anymore, not exactly out of fear, but out of respect. I think it's a distinction worth making. Fear paralyzes, respect moves. If you ever lived in a place that held something you weren't meant to know, tell me if you want. And if this story accompanied you tonight, I'm glad. Sleep well. We'll talk in the next one. This story was sent to me by a follower named Elena, who worked as a real estate agent showing properties for sale. What she discovered in the basement of a Victorian mansion made her quit her profession and move out of state. If you've worked in empty houses and felt that you weren't as alone as you thought, let me know in the comments. Now, this is Elena's experience with something that had been waiting in the darkness for over a century. My name is Elena, and for 10 years I worked as a real estate agent in New Orleans, Louisiana. I was good at my job, I knew the market, and I knew exactly what to say to close a sale. But after what I experienced 6 months ago, I will never enter an empty house alone again. It all started when my boss assigned me a special property. The Beaumont mansion had been on the market for years without selling. It was an impressive Victorian structure from 1872, located in the Garden District, with 3 floors, 12 rooms, and extensive gardens surrounded by a wrought iron wall. From the outside, it was beautiful, the kind of property that should sell within weeks. But there was a problem. All the agents who had shown it before reported that potential clients fled after the visits, pale and refusing to give explanations. Some agents even quit after working with the house. My boss was desperate to get rid of it. "Elena, you're my best agent," she told me. "If anyone can sell this house, it's you. The owners have significantly lowered the price. You just need to find the right buyer." I accepted the challenge without thinking. A commission on a mansion in the Garden District would be enough to cover my expenses for months. I scheduled my first visit to the property for a Tuesday afternoon. I arrived with my briefcase, my tablet, and my usual professional attitude. The mansion was even more impressive up close. The exterior walls were made of dark red brick, with tall arched windows and a wraparound porch with white columns. The gardens, although neglected, showed signs of having been magnificent once. I used the key my boss had given me to open the front door. It creaked open with a sound that echoed in the empty foyer. The interior smelled stale, of dust and dampness, but nothing unusual for a house that had been unoccupied for months. The foyer had high ceilings with ornate moldings, a curved mahogany staircase leading to the second floor, and crystal chandeliers covered in dust. The floors were made of fine wood, stained by time but still beautiful. With some minor renovations, this house could be spectacular. I spent the first hour exploring and taking photographs for the updated listing. The ground floor had a formal living room, a dining room capable of seating 20 people, a library with floor-to-ceiling built-in shelves, and a kitchen that needed to be completely remodeled. The second floor had 6 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom. They were empty except for some furniture covered with dusty sheets. The windows let in filtered light through heavy curtains that probably hadn't been opened in years. The third floor was an attic converted into what seemed to have been service rooms in the past. Small rooms, slanted ceilings, tiny windows. Nothing particularly interesting from a sales perspective. It was when I went back down to the first floor that I noticed something I had overlooked before. In the back hallway, behind the kitchen, there was a wooden door, painted the same color as the walls, almost camouflaged. I opened it and found stairs descending into darkness. The basement. For some reason, it wasn't on the plans I had reviewed. I searched for a light switch on the upper wall of the stairs. I found it and flipped it, but nothing happened. The bulbs must have been burnt out, or there simply wasn't electricity connected in that section. I took out my cell phone and used the flashlight. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I descended. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell changed from simple dampness to something more organic, almost sweet, like rotting flowers. The basement was larger than I expected, extending beneath the entire footprint of the house. The ceiling was low, with wooden beams darkened by over a century of moisture. The walls were made of stone, sweating with condensation, and along the walls were things, shelves filled with glass jars covered in dust. I approached to examine them more closely. They contained murky liquids, preserved roots, and in some cases, things I preferred not to identify. There were also old books stacked in boxes, their pages yellowed and brittle. On the back wall, there was something that made me stop. Symbols painted directly onto the stone with what appeared to be dark red paint, although something in my instinct told me it probably wasn't paint. The symbols formed a large circle, about 3 meters in diameter, with complex geometric designs inside it. In the exact center of the circle there was a chair, Antigua, carved from wood, with armrests that ended in grotesque animal heads. And tied to the chair with rotten ropes that disintegrated at touch, there was clothing. A Victorian dress, complete with corset, petticoats, all strangely preserved, as if it had just been removed from someone's body. This was definitely something that would need to be removed before showing the house to any potential clients. I took photographs as evidence to report to my boss. We would need to hire a specialized cleaning team to get rid of all this. As I was photographing, I noticed something else. On the floor around the chair were wax marks, dozens of circles where candles had been placed and burned down completely. And on the wall, behind the chair, someone had carved words into the stone. I approached to read them. They were in Old French, but my education in New Orleans allowed me to decipher the basic meaning. Here lies the one who traded with shadows. May her pact remain sealed for all eternity. May she never find release. A chill ran through me. What kind of place was this? Clearly it had been used for some kind of ritual, probably in the 19th century when the house was built. New Orleans had a long history of voodoo, witchcraft, and occult practices. It wasn't unusual to find artifacts from that past. But this felt different, darker, more deliberate. I decided that was enough for one day. I would go upstairs, call my boss, and recommend a complete cleaning of the basement before any visits. As I turned to leave, my flashlight flickered. It went out for a second. Then it turned back on. But in that second of darkness, I swear I heard something. A breath. Slow, deep, as if someone had been inhaling after holding their breath for a long time. "Is anyone here?" I called, my voice sounding higher than I wanted. There was no response, just the heavy silence of the basement and the sound of my own quickening breath. I climbed the stairs faster than I had come down, exited the basement, and slammed the door shut. Standing in the brightly lit hallway of the kitchen, I tried to calm myself. It had only been my imagination, fueled by the unsettling atmosphere and the strange artifacts. But then I heard it again. Not from the basement this time, but from above. The sound of footsteps on the second floor. Slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. "Hello?" I called up the stairs. "Is anyone up there? This is private property." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound. I stood there in the hallway debating what to do. It could be a vagrant who had found a way in. I should call the police. But then I heard a voice. A woman's voice. Soft, almost musical, singing something in French. The melody was old, melancholic. The kind of song that makes you feel a deep sadness without understanding why. Against my better judgment, I climbed the stairs. Professionally, I needed to ensure that there were no intruders on the property. Personally, something in that voice drew me in, called to me in a way I couldn't explain. The singing came from the master bedroom on the second floor. The door was ajar, and through the gap, I could see movement. A shadow moving against the light coming through the windows. I pushed the door fully open. The room was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no people, nothing but dust dancing in the afternoon sunbeams. But I had felt a presence. I had seen movement. And now, in the air, a scent floated. Perfume. Sweet. Floral. Ancient. "Whoever is here, you need to leave now," I said with all the firmness I could muster. "I'm going to call the police." The laughter that responded did not come from any specific direction. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was a woman's laughter, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness and something darker. "This is my house," the voice said, now speaking in English with a marked French accent. "It has been my house for 152 years. You are the intruder." I turned in a circle, searching for the source of the voice. "Where are you? Show yourself." "Are you sure you want to see me, little real estate agent?" "Most flee before reaching this point. You are braver, or more foolish. Time will tell." In the dusty mirror hanging on the wall, something began to materialize. At first it was just a smudge on the surface of the glass, like condensed breath. But gradually it took shape. The silhouette of a woman dressed in Victorian clothing, her face hidden behind a black veil. "What are you?" I whispered, unable to look away from the mirror. "I am Marguerite Beaumont, or what remains of her. I built this house in 1872 with the money from my late husband. I filled it with beauty, with life, with light. And then, well, Then I made a mistake. The figure in the mirror moved closer, and now I could see more details. Her dress was black silk, the kind worn for mourning. Her hands, visible beneath the lace gloves, were pale, almost translucent. What kind of mistake? The kind you make when you're desperate and alone. My husband died leaving me debts I couldn't pay. I was going to lose this house, everything I had. Then I met someone who offered me a solution. A man who claimed he could give me unlimited wealth in exchange for a small favor. A pact, I said, recalling the words carved in the basement. Yes, a pact with something that pretended to be a man, but was anything but human. He gave me gold, enough to pay all my debts and live in luxury for the rest of my days. In exchange, he promised he would come to claim his payment when I died. And what happened? The figure in the mirror laughed bitterly. I was clever, or so I thought. I performed a different ritual, one I found in an ancient book of black magic. A ritual that would allow me to bind myself to this house after my death, preventing my soul from being claimed. I thought I would be free, but it didn't work. Oh, it worked. My soul is tied to this house, unable to move beyond these walls. But the demon is also tied here, waiting. Every day, every night, for over a century, it has been waiting for me to make a mistake, to stray from the protections I set, to finally allow it to claim me. I stepped back from the mirror, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. This can't be real. Ghosts don't exist. Demons don't exist. Don't they? Marguerite asked. Her reflection disappeared from the mirror, and for a moment, I thought she was gone. Then I felt something behind me, a cold presence, so close that if it were solid, it could have touched my shoulder. I turned around and there it was, not a reflection but a complete manifestation. Marguerite Beaumont, or her ghost, standing 2 meters away. I could see through her to the wall behind, but her form was clear, defined, and when she lifted the black veil that covered her face, I saw that she had paid a terrible price for her pact. Her face was withered, aged beyond the natural. The skin clung to the skull like stretched parchment. The eyes were deep black hollow sockets. The mouth, when it opened, revealed rotten teeth. "This is what time does when you can't die properly," he said. "I keep aging, withering away, but I can never rest." And he waits in the basement, where I performed the binding ritual, waiting for his chance. As if his words had been a signal, I heard something from below, a deep resonant roar that made the windows tremble in their frames. It was not a sound that could come from any human throat. "He knows you're here," Marguerite said. "A new soul in his domain. He will want to claim you too, just as he has tried to claim everyone who has entered this house." "Then I'm leaving," I said, moving toward the door. "I'm leaving and never coming back." "I wish it were that simple," Marguerite replied sadly. "But you've been in the basement. You've seen the circle. You've broken the seal unknowingly when you took photographs. The light from your device, the flash, disrupted the protections. Now he is stronger than he has been in decades." As if to confirm her words, I heard footsteps coming up from the basement. But they weren't normal footsteps. They sounded heavy, dragging, as if something massive were ascending the stairs. And with each step, the temperature in the house dropped. My breath became visible. Frost began to form on the edges of the windows, drawing impossible patterns. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, becoming denser, as if they were taking on substance of their own. "Hide," Marguerite whispered, her form already fading away. "Don't look at it directly. Don't talk to it. And above all, don't accept any offer it makes." She completely dissolved, leaving me alone just as something reached the second floor. I could hear it in the hallway, moving with deliberate purpose. I desperately searched for a hiding place. There was a built-in closet in the wall. I dove inside, closing the door quietly, leaving only a small crack to see through. Through that crack, I saw something enter the room, and I wish I had never seen it. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but completely wrong in all its details. Tall, too tall to pass through normal doors without bending down. Its skin was like dark, cracked leather, with red light shining from the fissures. The horns protruding from its head were twisted, like dead branches, and its eyes burned with a fire that gave no light, only darkness. It moved around the room, sniffing the air. When it spoke, its voice was multiple, as if hundreds of people were speaking in unison in different tones. New soul, young, unmarked, delicious. It stopped, turning its head in a way that no human joint would allow. It was looking directly at the closet where I was hiding. "Do you think I can't smell you? Feel the terror pumping through your veins? Come out, let's talk." I held my breath, not moving. I remembered Marguerite's warning. Don't look, don't speak. The creature approached the closet. I could see its claws, 5 fingers ending in sharp black nails reaching for the door. Slowly, it began to open it. At that moment, Marguerite materialized again, placing herself between the creature and the wardrobe. "She is under my protection," she said with a firm voice despite her ethereal form. "This is my house. You have no claim over her." The creature laughed, a sound like metal scraping stone. "Your house, yes. But I have a claim over you, Marguerite, and eventually, you will make a mistake. They always do. And when you do, not only will your soul be mine, but also that of anyone you try to protect." "Not today," Marguerite replied. She raised her translucent hands and began to sing in Latin. The words resonated with power, making the air vibrate. The symbols she had seen in the basement began to glow faintly on the walls of the room, appearing as if they had always been there, just invisible until now. The creature roared with fury, but it recoiled. Marguerite's protections, weak as they might be, still held some power. "This is not over," the demon promised as it retreated down the hallway. "I will return, and next time none of you will be able to stop me." She descended the stairs, and I heard the basement door open and close. The cold in the air began to gradually dissipate. I emerged from the closet trembling, barely able to stand. Marguerite floated in front of me, her form flickering faintly. "You must leave," she said. "Now, and never come back. This house must never be sold. It must never be inhabited. It must remain empty until I find a way to end this permanently." "Why did you help me?" I asked. "You don't know me." "Because I have seen too many souls taken by him over the years. Real estate agents, potential buyers, people who simply got lost and sought refuge. They all suffered because I was too cowardly to face my fate over a century ago. There has to be a way to free you, to free both of us from this." Marguerite smiled sadly. "There is a way. The pact can only be broken if someone willingly takes my place. If someone accepts the deal I made, taking on my debt. But I would never ask for such a thing. The condemnation I have lived, I wouldn't wish it on anyone." I went down the stairs with Marguerite floating behind me. At the front door I stopped. "How much longer can you hold on?" I asked. "I don't know. Decades maybe. Or maybe just days. The protections weaken every year. And every time someone enters this house, it awakens him again, makes him stronger." I left the Beaumont mansion and never looked back. I drove straight to my boss's office and resigned on the spot. I told her that the house should not be sold under any circumstances, that it should be condemned and demolished. Of course, she didn't believe me. She thought I was exaggerating for dramatic reasons. She assigned the house to another agent. A week later, that agent disappeared. She entered the Beaumont mansion for a scheduled visit and never came out. The police found her car parked outside, her cell phone in the foyer, but no trace of her. The case remains unsolved. After that, the house was finally condemned. It is closed now, with boards on the windows and warnings not to enter. But sometimes when I pass by at night, I swear I see lights moving behind those boarded-up windows, and I hear a soft singing, a woman's voice singing old French songs in the dark. Marguerite Beaumont is still there, bound to her house, waiting for a release that may never come. And in the basement, in that circle of symbols, something waits with her, waiting for the next mistake, the next unwary soul, the next opportunity to reclaim what was promised to her over a century ago. I moved out of New Orleans 3 months ago. I no longer work in real estate. Now I teach at an elementary school, surrounded by innocent children and structured days. It's simple. It's safe. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see that withered face behind the veil. I still hear that voice promising to protect me. And I wonder how much longer Marguerite will be able to keep her vigil before the demon finally wins. And I wonder if there will ever be peace for her, or if her punishment will truly be eternal. Thus concludes Elena's experience. She told me that sometimes she still has nightmares about that mansion and what dwells in its basement. The property remains condemned to this day, and rumors of disappearances around it keep the curious away. If you have ever worked with properties that seemed not to want to be sold, share your story in the comments. Sometimes houses hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. Sleep well tonight.